delighted that you were here. One of those things where we didn't know who would show up on a July day with the sun out on the first day of summer. But obviously the reason we're here is because of what we now call really is global warming, and it's a crisis. And over the last week, we've seen, both here and around the world, how dire the situation is. But there's also the other side of the way to look at this as an opportunity. There's a Chinese word for crisis. It's called Wei Ji. It's actually two words. I don't know Chinese at all, but I've learned this. And Wei means crisis, and Ji means opportunity. So this is an opportunity for us, in many ways, to kind of take action, to create something. If we look at old growth forests, we need to create something that we may not see in our lifetime. As many people define old growth forests as 140 years or more. We have, I think, less than 1% of that in the Northeast. We certainly have areas like Baxter, the Adirondacks. There's a place here, Sunapee. Have you ever been to Sunapee Old Growth Forest? There's a link actually in some of the handouts that we'll send you that there's a 25-minute video on the Sunapee Forest, which is 300 or 400 years old, I believe, and hasn't been touched. The trees aren't huge, but they're definitely old, and it's a pretty solid ecosystem. So with that, I'd like to get started with our panel, and we have as our moderator Nadine, and Nadine comes out from New England Wilderness Trust, and she is going to moderate for us. And Nadine Cantor, Nadine is a graduate of UMass Amherst, has a degree from UPenn in communications and environmental studies, has been adjunct professor and scholar teaching at Middlebury for more than 21 years in many different capacities. So we're delighted, and she's the head of communications at New England Northeast Wilderness Trust. We're delighted to have her here today. We were looking for a moderator, and you have come just at the right time to be here. So I'd like to turn it over to Nadine.
Thank you. So welcome everyone. It's a great crowd, and I think we've got a bunch online, which is fantastic. Just for a quick show of hands, are you here because you're on your conservation commission? Are you here because, how about that? Pause right there. Nice. Okay. Great. What about landowner? Are you thinking about what do I do with my? Great. Thank you. Yeah. Good. And it is Northeast Wilderness Trust, because we work in New England and New York. So we have, as John said, over 79,000 acres in forever wild conservation protection. So tonight, we are going to hear from this esteemed panel here that I am just blown away by myself to be here in the company of these brilliant minds and longtime folks that's really studying and working in this field and thinking about what do we do with our trees. So I'm going to set this up so that we are going to hear from each one, and I'm going to ask you to save your questions until the end. So if you have a piece of paper or something, that would be great. Jot down for your thoughts. Most of you have handouts. If you don't, John said he's going to be passing things. We're going to send things out by email afterwards. We expect this to be the beginning of a great conversation. John has done a beautiful job setting this up and sort of bringing people together to talk about where we're at. And I'd like to introduce the panel, and they're all going to have about 10 minutes, and I'm going to start introducing each one, and then they're going to move from one to the next. And the first person who's going to present to us tonight is William Moomaw, which is Bill, right? Is that okay, Bill? He's a professor emeritus of environmental policy at Tufts University, and is a distinguished visiting scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. And he's worked on technological climate solutions for 20 years as the lead author of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Natural Climate Solutions, with a focus on forests and wetlands for the last 15 years. Next to me here is Dan Stepanouskas. Did I say it right? Okay, thank you. That's a great name. Who is a consulting forester in New Hampshire. And he's a forester who's worked for a wide array of conservation groups, conservation commissions, land trusts, corporations, and landowners with long-term management perspectives. He consulted during a lot of this time in these past few decades for the scientific certification system to certify and audit large landowners to the criteria of the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, which some of you may know about. I know it's something that I have followed for a long time. He is a founding member of the Forest Stewards Guild, where he has made presentations to the Pew Charitable Trust, Ford Foundation, and Doris Duke Foundation to demonstrate the need to practice forestry that imitates nature. He also spent 8 years on the board of directors for the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust. And the third, we're going to hear from John Rowe, who's two over from me. John is a forest ecologist, and he has worked at 4 different land trusts, overseeing the conservation management of land in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and 33 years in Vermont. During his 19 years at the Vermont Nature Conservancy, he helped with TNC's eco-regional conservation planning and managed the 25,000 acres of the Atlas Timberlands for both TNC and Vermont Land Trust. Then we're going to hear from Eric Jones, who is a private landowner, protects 1,500 acres of wildlands in New Hampshire. Eric was born in Vermont, raised in Massachusetts, retired in New Hampshire and Florida. He was educated also at UMass, we have that in common, Antioch College, and the University of Chicago Law School. He was part of Air Force Intelligence Officer Special Ops, Foreign Service Officer, entrepreneur, and preservationist. And he was one of Al Gore's climate reality leaders. And he would like you all to know that his finest achievement on that, where is she? I was just sitting with her, is that he married the right woman. I love her. And then finally, Bob Linck, who works with Northeast Wilderness Trust and is our conservation director there. Bob brings a lot of experience. He's worked for 5 different land trusts, Upper Valley being one of them, in his 43-year career, including the Connecticut River Watershed Council, out of the old Vermontshire Museum on Lime Road, the Upper Valley Land Trust, and the Vermont Land Trust before joining Northeast Wilderness Trust in early 2023. So that is our lineup. And there's no big clock, so I'm going to apologize because I'm going to be looking at my phone a little bit more than I thought I was going to be. There's a huge clock right in the back.
And one thing I forgot to mention too, if you have your phones, I forgot to tell you to turn them off. I just turned mine off.
Oh,
we
yeah.
haven't already put on you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, what we're going to do is move from person to person. Because I'm not long on I don't remember names immediately. Tell me your name one more time. Michael, my dad's name, I should have remembered. For the panelists, Michael is going to be timing you. And when he holds up that pink number 1, that means you have 1 minute left to go. So we're going to try and keep us on schedule. Yes?
Yeah, I know it's maybe a little hard to hear. Rather than have people stand up because it's casual, if you have trouble hearing or you're not hearing so well, please move down front. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. So I really appreciate it if you do that now, because we're not going to have them stand up. We're going to have them sit. So please, if you can't hear, move down front.
At least have them raise their hand, the one who's speaking.
Well, they're each going to speak one at a time. So it'll be 10 minutes. So, okay?
Can't hear them.
Well, can you move down front? Yeah, please.
There's a couple seats still. No, I think we are not. So, and let me also say, 5 people on a panel is the most you ever want to see on a panel. So we are at the top of your ability to take in information and their ability to give you everything they know in 10 minutes. So just, be patient, listen acutely. This will be recorded. You'll have a chance to look at it again if you feel like you missed something. I know someone had to leave early. They left a question with me for the Q&A at the end. Will be a little bit of a break between the presentations and the Q&A, so they'll get a chance to sort of mill about it.
They're all so cute. I mean, come on.
And you are. You're about to. All right. I think with that, we are going to start with Bill. And Michael's going to be your timer and your guide for that 1 minute, and turn it over to you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is my first time speaking to a post-climate change audience. How many of you experienced climate change consequences in the past week?
Walking in the door.
Usually when I'm speaking to audiences, it's about what will happen in the future. And maybe their grandchildren will have to worry about it. I think finally, after 35 years of saying, I feel like Paul Revere, and he got captured by the British and never got to deliver the message. It has never been taken seriously by most of the people. And yet we, all of us in this room, are responsible for climate change. We have, as of in 2022, was the magic year when the amount of carbon dioxide, the major heat trapping gas in the atmosphere, increased by 50% over what it was pre-industrially in 1750. That's quite a remarkable. In other words, the most intense heat trapping gas. We've added half again to it in that time. Secondly, we may not be aware of this, but things could be a whole lot worse. We could have the amount of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere now in the 1950s, except for one thing. There are a lot of forests on the planet, and those plants have been accumulating carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. Without that, there would be a third more, almost a third, so 30% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we would have hit this limit we are today in the 1950s. So think of forest when you see one. 2/3 of the atmospheric carbon dioxide is from burning fossil fuels. The other third is from deforestation and land disruption, wetland destruction. In other words, destroying the natural world has put a third of the carbon dioxide that's there. If we look at, there's been a new study that looks at global carbon emissions from harvest and finds that between about 2010 projected out to 2050, fully 10% or the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted from just the harvesting process, not the machines and everything else, but just all of the decay of the material that isn't used. I mean, if you get we hear that wood stores carbon. It does. There's carbon in these. Half of this by weight is carbon. But to get 1 pound here, something like 4 pounds of carbon dioxide went into the atmosphere. Okay, so it's a heavy investment in order to store carbon in wood. So this recent study showed that globally, the amount of carbon dioxide coming from harvest is equivalent to 10% of all fossil fuels. Earlier in 2016, a study was done about the United States. The emissions from harvest in the United States is about equivalent to the emissions from all our remaining coal burning power plants, or the direct emissions from all the buildings in the United States every single year. So this is a whole new way to look at the problem. So, we've been told we have to be net zero by 2050. I don't like net accounting because it hides things. My bank account, yeah, I'd like to know the net, and I'd like to know how much is in there and how much is going in and how much is coming out, because that tells me where I'm headed, right? And if I just look at it and say, oh, there's a net $100 in my account, doesn't tell me a whole lot of information that I really need to know to manage my money or my forest, for that matter, if those are trees. Well, global temperatures are supposed to be limited to no more than the Celsius number is 1.5 degrees. That's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And if we do that, then things won't be much worse than they were this past week. Well, we're on a trajectory that's going like this. So last week is already too late, too little, too late. So we really need to get to work on this. What's really interesting is the shift from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that's focused almost entirely on technological solutions. That's what I did for 5 reports over 20 years. At the end of that period, the last one dealt with bioenergy. And there was something about the work on energy coming from burning wood or burning plants or burning oils or something, vegetable oils. Just didn't sit right with me. So I started looking into it. And what I discovered is that that's really a bad idea. Burning wood, and I thought it was great after the oil shocks of 1973. I got a wood stove like everybody else, and I felt so proud of myself. And you'd go to gatherings, and everybody would brag about how many cords of wood they burned the previous winter. No, they should have been talking about how little they had to burn in order to meet things, because their houses were so inefficient, so leaky and everything. So fix the houses, and then you don't have to burn much of anything. And now we don't have to burn anything because we can do it all with heat pumps and other things that don't emit carbon dioxide. So here's what the IPCC is saying now. Safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystems is fundamental to climate resilient development with very high confidence. Getting a group of scientists to agree on something with very high confidence is not an easy task. I can tell you, having spent hours and hours trying to get even a little bit of confidence that we had the right answer. So this is really something that most scientists who work on this climate change agree on. Maintaining the resiliency of biodiversity and ecosystem services at a global scale depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. That's with high confidence. The reason it's not with very high confidence is they're not sure whether it's 30 or 50 we need. Okay. Building the resilience of biodiversity and supporting ecosystem integrity. There's a new term, very important. I'll tell you what it means in a moment. It can maintain benefits for people as well as contributing to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So what is ecosystem integrity? It's the ability of an ecosystem, a forest, let's say, in this case, to maintain its key ecological processes, all the things that it does, and recover from disturbance to some disasters and reduce risk and contribute to both climate change adaptation and mitigation. Forests absorb carbon dioxide, they store carbon. They also evaporate a lot of water. That's part of resilience because, well, talk to the folks in Montpelier, right? They sure to use something that would really evaporate more water before it filled up the streets. And trees do that. In the process, they cool. And it's so stunning when you go into a forest, it's the shade, but no, it's really the evaporative cooling that makes it feel like air conditioning. And that also has a global effect of radiating the heat that's in that water vapor that's now up at the top of the atmosphere much more rapidly into space. So forests are now finding have even more important things that they do besides just carbon. And finally, they said there's the following statement. Managing forests for ecosystem integrity will optimize long-term carbon storage and the provision of other ecosystem services. And this final one is sort of the punchline. Protecting of existing natural forest ecosystems is the highest priority for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's a direct quote. What stunned me when I looked at it was they cite the paper that I and Ed Faison and Susan Messino published in 2019, where we basically made that argument, which was has been totally ridiculed by the forestry industry. 10 professors at Yale Law School wrote the most unprofessional letter saying that this was just an opinion piece and shouldn't be taken seriously because we gave it a name. We said, we have deforestation, or we do reforestation. We can plant trees somewhere that they've never grown before, that's afforestation. But there was no term for let the trees grow. And we coined the term proforestation, which I didn't realize at the time. The reason the forestry industry is so upset about it is because the antonym to proforestation is anti-forestation. And they don't want to be seen as being anti-forestation. So I apologize for that confusion. I wasn't a Latin scholar, so I just chose to use my Google to find a prefix that would work. So that's what we really need to do, is to grow more forests until they get old. Thank you.
Dan?
Thanks. My name is Daniel Stepanouskas. I've been a forester for a long time. You can tell that at a glance. And I've learned a great deal. Forestry is my only form of research has been anecdotal because I'm not paid as a researcher. So I have learned by doing and watching. And when you watch things, you gain a great deal of knowledge. If you go back in 3 years, you see what you thought would happen, and it didn't. Or in 5 years, or in 10 years. So this is how you get it. What we have to do, up here is a bit of an antithesis, telling you how you can manage your forest. In other words, how you can cut some trees and be okay. And let me just say one quote here. Aldo Leopold, leave every cog in the wheel is first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So that pretty well says what you should be doing in the forest. You can have people who use small machinery and take out trees, like the old skid roads in the woods that you walked years ago that were narrow and winding. And it was like, oh, maybe somebody cut some trees here. Oh, maybe they didn't. It can be done in that way, and it still can be done in that way. Now, it's not as easy, and there aren't a lot of people doing it, and there aren't a lot of foresters using people who do that because they're just not out there, and it's slow money. But it can be done, and it is being done. And that is a way that you can do that. You can, when I walk into a forest, all this information comes in, and you're instantly, getting just tons of things, like 50 things are coming at you at once. You look at the forest and you go, oh, I know what the site index here is. I know what trees it should be growing. You can tell by the form of the trees, the height of the trees, by the herbaceous vegetation, the shrub vegetation. It all just starts to come clear. And site index is one of the most important things that you have to think about in your forest. If you grow a tree, what we call off-site, where it shouldn't be, it will not thrive. It will go slowly. It will consume less carbon dioxide. You put a sugar maple on a pile of sand, and if it survives, it'll be that big in 50 years. Where the white pine, you're going to be getting someplace. So it's so important in sequestering carbon. Okay, so site index is essential to keep track of and to learn about. So I guess I'm selling myself in a bit that you need foresters to tell you these things. And forestry should imitate nature. Forests here, when they get tall, trees will blow down. And they'll blow over in generally not in large areas. That happens from, events like hurricanes, gross events, but they'll fall down in bunches. So you'll have an open patch, but it won't be very large. And sometimes it's individual trees, and it'll be fine. But to do that, if you don't make your opening a little larger in a place where it's a low site index, and you have beech on the forest floor and short oak growing above it, that tells you right there that it is a low site index. And you have to make your opening a little larger so the intolerant or moderate tolerant species, which are usually the ones you want to grow, will outcompete the beech because they cannot do it without more light because they're intolerant of shade. Okay. You can tell a rich soil almost immediately when you walk in by the trees that are growing and everything else, but you'll often see sugar maple seedlings on the ground growing. And that happens in a rich site, not on a poor site. So I think that's good for how we can, I can't go into silviculture any more deeply than that because we'll be here for a long time. And now what do we do with your old forests? What we're here about. How do you grow them and how do you maintain them? Well, there are two large elephants in the room. In the room of silviculture and in the room of growing old forests in general. One is the big one, he's climate change. And the other guy is invasive species. And you can debate which is more existential, but I guess it's climate right now. But invasive species are very, very threatening. And they're a huge threat to our forests. You can have a beautiful closed canopy forest, where it's all shade. And if you get buckthorn in that forest, it will form a canopy 10 or 12 feet off the ground so no light gets to the forest floor and the forest floor becomes a desert. There's nothing growing. I mean, nothing. I've seen 100 acres like that. So if you're preserving your forest to get old, you have to have someone walk through it and look for the invasive species and extirpate. Have to do that on your piece of land. You can't just let them be. You can't say, oh, there's a few. Once it gets beyond, you won't be able to get it back because it becomes everywhere and impossible to reclaim. Another thing to do if you are attempting to grow old forest is have a good forester walk through there and say, okay, I know the goal here. We're growing late successional forests. We're growing forests that'll make it for the next 85 years. See, we always think out 85 years, how long it takes to grow these trees. But now with climate change, you're thinking, how warm is it going to get in 85 years? Now, there is some speculation involved here, clearly. But we have a clue that it's going to be very serious. So the international panel, I can't remember the name, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, cumbersome, is studying which trees will survive. They're studying everything about the forest and climate change in the Northeast. They are funded by the federal government, but they run quite independently from the federal government. And they're telling us which ones they think will make it, and which ones will thrive, and which won't. Oaks, maples, pretty good. White pine, good. Spruce, fir, not good. Firs especially bad. Tamaracks especially bad. Aspens are also not very good. So, and they think beech won't be as good either. And that's just the beginning. We don't know what we don't know yet. There's a whole lot. So you have to think out there. So the guy walks through your forest and the good forester says, okay, I can get these trees to grow better and they will produce more mast and they will do wonderful things for the forest ecosystem. And this tree here is really not doing much. It might be a red maple or some other tree. I don't mean to pick on red maple. They will probably inherit the earth in a warming climate. But you want to have someone just take out a bit, drop the tree and leave it, because that's what you see in old forests. You see the trees lying on the ground. You see the stump and you see the line where the tree decayed. When you have stumps with no lines and no evidence of the bole of the tree, that means it was harvested, especially if it's kind of flat on top. But a natural forest has that debris on the forest floor. It's part of the ecosystem. It will enrich your old forest. It will increase the species diversity. It's all good. The bears will rip the bark off looking for grubs. It's all cool stuff. Birds are pecking away. You can do so much by having those few trees cut that it's amazing. And leaving old forests, I think, is, as Bill has already taught us, cooling. So this helps preserve our forests. This helps preserve our land from the warming. Because the warming is really, really coming on very fast. I'm frightened by it. It's difficult to work in the woods now. It's so nasty out here. I see invasive species everywhere, and most of the time it's too late. It's just too late. it's gotten away. You know, there's a billion of them growing in the forest. How do you do that? You can't afford to do that, and no one will do it for you because it's the same work. They'll do it in a reasonable way when there's not too much, but they'll probably do it for the rest of it, but you can't afford it. The forest is an organism. It's all interconnected. It's 1,000 beating hearts or 10,000 beating hearts, and it's all one organism. And so you have to treat it that way. You have to look at it and go, okay, how can I do this to keep this organism healthy and well? And that's what you're going to do with your old forest, and that's what you're going to do with your managed forest too. Make small openings. When they say you have to have 5-acre or 10-acre clear cuts, that's a fallacy. You don't need that to grow any species. If you make, even a ½ acre is usually good, but an acre for sure. But a ½ acre will almost always suffice to grow every species. So that's what you wish to do. Thank you.
So, hello. In my handout, I tried to do this in a little more detail, but in this talk, I'm going to briefly touch on basically 5 key ecological points that are often wrong in or wrongly argued in the public discourse, and 3 ideas or methods for meaningfully changing the carbon trajectory. But I wanted to start out first with my overarching message, and this is we pick up from where Dan is, and all of what he said is absolutely going to be necessary, but I'm also interested in really bending the curve so that we don't get past the 1.5. And for that, my message is that the incremental changes in forestry and forestry policy are just not going to get there. If we're going to get to 30 years of carbon net zero, and prevent one of the first tipping points of no return will be the melting of the planet's ice. We're going to need wrenching, painful change, and we need to be starting to talk about that. I've been involved in some of the policy debates in Vermont, and nobody wants to talk about it. We are talking about wrenching change in the forestry world and in other things, and we need to start talking about that now. It's the only way we're going to get something that looks sort of like what we're used to, and as Bill said, the last 2 weeks are already baked in, so we're not changing that. So first I want to talk about old forests and the fact that old forests and old trees store and take up more carbon than young forests and trees. There's no high tech needed. To get meaningful carbon uptake, you just have to stop cutting. And there are 3 what I would call misleading statements around this concept. 1, young trees are better because they grow faster and therefore they take up carbon faster. And 2, plant trees. And 3, using wood, particularly for most things, but it's often talked about in energy, is carbon neutral. They all sound good, but they're all misleading and to a certain extent false. We'll tackle first the rate of growth, which is a forestry measurement. It's a measure of how fast the trunk diameter is growing, and it's relatively meaningless in an ecological and climate perspective. Growth is really based on the amount of leaf area that's capturing sun. A lot of complexities around that, but just the easy way to think about it is old forests are dark and cool because they've captured all the sun. And that's an easy way to look at how what the ecologists would call the leaf area index is working. Planting a tree helps a little bit if there's no tree there. But a 30-year-old tree, it doesn't have a whole lot of carbon. And I would argue that's probably worth taking the effort of planting trees and start figuring out how society can work to make all of our teepee from bamboo or annual crops rather than from old trees. That will have far bigger impact than planting trees. And then the using of trees for offsetting fossil fuels. is really only carbon neutral over a span of a time frame of 150 to 200 years. The details are all make it more complex. But that's really the picture that is carbon neutral. We only have 30 years. And the simplest way to understand this is if you cut a 60-year-old tree, you're now converting 60 years of storage, depending on how you use it, but within 30 years that we've got, most of that will end up in the atmosphere. Then you've got the 60 years that tree, if you hadn't cut it, would have grown. And then you have all the fuel that you've used to process and do stuff. And so that you're talking about, you don't get that payback until 120 to 150, maybe even 200 years in some situations. And that is obviously not the 30 years we've got. And finally, my other example of planting trees is yesterday, Kevin McCarthy proposed in all seriousness that the Republican response to climate change would be to plant 1 trillion trees. Well, there's a total of 3 trillion trees on the planet. So that in its face is basically a meaningless soundbite. And you can do all kinds of math and stuff. It's a soundbite, but it's a perfect example of what we don't need right now. We need serious discussion and about wrenching change. So there are a few other points. There's a misconception that forests have to be harvested for forest health. Basically, with few exceptions, management adds stress, as Dan talked about, invasive adds stress, with the possible exception of some forests adapted for fire. The best way for a forest in general to adjust to climate change is to basically not add known and unknown stresses and just let it grow for another 50 or 100 years or even old growth. All of those timeframes have benefits. Third point, the forests around us, which are largely northern hardwood forests, are globally significant. And many people don't understand that. We're not talking about operating at the edges of things. This northern hardwood forest is globally significant. It's large enough geographically, extends all the way to the upper Midwest. It's very carbon dense, both in the trees and in the soil. And it has above average landscape integrity. And as both the previous speakers talked about, it also is intact enough to regionally cool because of the hydrologic cycle, and that gives us some breathing space, so to speak, in the direct effects of the temperature increases. Fourth, the forest products industry will argue that if we don't cut here, it's just going to move elsewhere, and we cut about half of the annual growth, and therefore we're sustainable. Both sound true, but they're both misleading. It's a very complex topic, well beyond this, but timber markets are huge and not necessarily elastic. The simplest answer is that if you cut less in a carbon-dense, globally significant place and it shifts to a climate, into a plantation and less carbon-dense, you get a climate wind. There's more carbon stored. And on sustainability, ecological sustainability is not just replacing the forest you cut when it's already degraded. We're talking about a forest that has immense capacity to increase its stocking, increase its biodiversity, and we need to increase the stocking levels rapidly, not talk about, well, we're cutting less than growth. That's just basically slowing the rate of degradation. And lastly, on the ecological points is early successional species tend to be justified for almost all management and policy that gets discussed. And they have evolved to find openings in the forest. That is what they do really well. And we don't need to help them. They'll get there. And the wind the speeds that are going to increase and the storms are going to increase those openings. So we really don't need to worry about early successional species. And 1 acre, as Dan mentioned, is considered small in the forestry world. It's actually huge ecologically, and we don't need openings of that size. I would go even smaller than Dan. A 1/10 of an acre gets everything you need. And 10 1/10 acre openings are far more important ecologically than one acre opening. And that is a huge difference.
I'm sorry. Nice to hear.
So the three actions or three methods that I think are really important, public forests are for public good. And right now, I would argue that climate mitigation is pretty much at the top of that list. The benefit of public forests is that they don't have to be managed for financial return. And that's really important. And because of that, they should be leading in the use of forest for forest carbon sequestration. And so I would feel that most public forests should just be let grow for the next 100 years. They can do that. There's absolutely no ecological downside for 100 years more growth on that forest. And our landscapes, by any scientific ecological measure, need more old growth forest, and they can benefit from more mature forests. And in the long run, we would actually get more timber. The second one is payment for ecosystem services, which in this arena is called carbon credits. I gave a whole talk about that. It is way too complex to cover in any detail here. The moment that people are interested, they can ask questions, but the quick points that I would make is that it can and should play a role to allow many private landowners to get a financial return for growing forests, not just for harvesting forests. It gives an alternative way for landowners to receive a return. And those private forest cover is far larger than the public lands. So what happens on our private lands here will have global implications. And we shouldn't forget that. It's that as we manage our private lands, that's how we're going to have an impact on global climate. Right now, carbon markets are really the Wild West. And I can't, the details are that it's a place that's growing leaps and bounds. There have been problems in the past. Some of the experiences are showing that that things haven't played out as planned, and probably is greenwashing. Our public policies often don't fit the idea of carbon credits and letting trees grow. I'm from Vermont. The land use taxation method for keeping forests is antithetical to letting forests just grow. And so that needs to be changed. In the past couple of years, there's clearly nobody's ready for wrenching change there, and it's needed pretty desperately. And finally, if you are interested, two final points. If you're going to buy carbon credits, I would argue that it's best to do that in the forest world because of some of the previous points made. But I'd focus on things that have no harvest for 40 or 100 years, and ideally in some contexts that have easements incorporated in them so that they don't go backwards after that forest carbon has accumulated. There are two markets, and I'd close on this part of it, be that the European is a regulated market. We know those are successful. It's how we dealt with acid rain. And right now that market today was priced around $90 a ton of carbon. That's a decent price. It will drive some change. The other one, which is is the one where the growth is just straight up and people are trying to make lots of money. There are a lot of people putting together projects. It's called the voluntary market. The high of that was around $20 at the end of 21 or beginning of 22. Right now it's at $2.50 a ton, which I would argue is pretty much just greenwashing. So right now it's not serving a climate change mechanism. But I don't want to leave you with that. It is a mechanism which we can pay landowners. It just needs to be much fairer price for carbon that reflects reality. And right now that market is structured for people to bid for the lowest possible price for carbon rather than higher prices. Last point, public policy right now needs to start trying to figure out if we're going to shift policy to using forest carbon sequestration as a climate mitigation, public policy needs to have the debate right now on how much and who will support the jobs that are lost if we're going to decrease harvest. We can't just have that as an afterthought. And we did this in the North Atlantic for fisheries in the 70s and the 80s when they needed to, the age structure of the fisheries wrong. They carefully thought out how to make sure the people that had jobs in that place, in that industry, didn't fall apart. And we need to do that now, right now, start those discussions for the forest industry. Thank you.
Eric.
Assalamu alaikum. Masal Kaya. Ala Siddiq Ismi Eric Jones. Peace upon you. Good evening, my friends. And my name is Eric Jones. Why have I chosen to begin my topic like that? Because the genesis of what I have done and what my wife has done is based in the Middle East. We were in the Foreign Service in the Middle East, living in Beirut, Lebanon, in the embassy there. And one day we were sent to Amman, Jordan. So you go over the high mountains in Lebanon and you get 35 miles later, you're in Damascus, Syria. You may not understand how close that is, but it is. And then you turn right or south and you head to Amman, Jordan. And you're now traveling on the ancient Roman road. And you get about halfway down there and you're hungry, or we were. And we take out our brand bag, that was early in our life, we had brown bags. And you stop the car and you look around and you are surrounded on all sides by the Syrian desert. Now, the Syrian desert has to be understood. If you're familiar with Lawrence of Arabia, you're seeing these big mounds of sand and these beautiful scenes. It's not that. It is a complete devoid of any wildlife, any vegetation. Now, I'm told that deserts are full of things and lots of birds and everything, but trust me, you could see nothing. Okay, we looked at that while we're munching on our peanut butter sandwiches. And we said, whoa, this is, and then we said, whoa, in Bible times, this area that we're looking at right here was part of the deep, dark cedars of Lebanon forest. How could this be? What happened? How could we be looking at this wasteland? People and goats. And you say, goats? Goats will eat anything. And they are the livestock they're the prominent livestock in the Middle East. Okay. So we looked at that and we said, whoa, this is what people can do. These people, 2,000 years ago, obviously did not realize that what they did, what their personal activity was, could affect the environment in which they live. That was a life-changing experience for us. You're going to say, whoa, they must not have too many life-changing experiences. No, but anyway, this was a big deal. So some years later, we came back to the States. And like every expatriate, you expect the place, the town, the city, wherever you departed from, to look exactly like it did when you left, which is kind of dumb, but that's what we did. Okay, well, it didn't. there were interstate highways, there were big box stores, there were lots of houses, and there was a whole lot less forest. Now, both my wife, Margaret, who was in the audience, and I, even though we were 3,000 miles apart, we were raised in the woods. Lucky us. So when we saw that, whoa, this is a different deal here, this affected us. We thought, well, it ain't the Syrian desert, but it's moving in that direction. So we thought, what can we do? Well, what can anybody do? But what can we do? So, not having a lot of money at that point, or even at this point, we decided, well, we would give $100, $200 to the Sierra Club. Back then, they were real Rottweiler. You know what I mean? The environmental groups didn't like them because they take no prisoners. Now, I think they take a few prisoners. But at any rate, so we gave money, here and there. And then I thought, well, that really isn't enough. If we can do more, we should do more. So we thought, well, okay, what would that be? Well, we look around. We were in New Hampshire at that point. And we thought, well, okay. And back then, there were 100 acres here, 50 acres there, and 200 acres. Not anymore, but there was then. So we thought, well, we'll buy land. We'll buy wild land and we'll set it aside. No logging, no disturbance of any kind, even by humans, us. Well, we get to go on it because we own it, but we try not to throw any papers out. Okay, so anyways, well, okay, where? We thought, well, we did a little more research, and it's always better if you try to save something to have it connected with something that's already saved, or let's call it semi-saved. Okay, so we decided, well, there's this big glob here, two big globs, the National Forest in New Hampshire, the main part and the northern part. So we thought, okay, our mantra will be to look at land that is attached, is abutting these semi-saved lands, okay? And that's what we've done. And that was a long time ago. And we now have 1,500 acres. The second thing we've done is we planted trees. Now, we've planted 2,000 trees. Now, according to John over here, we've wasted our time. However, those trees are now, not planted trees, but they're over my head. They're over your heads. They're like 20 feet high. Okay, so somewhere down the road, they're going to be old growth. Probably no one in this room is going to enjoy them. We're all going to be dead. However, maybe I saw a little child there. They're not here. Anyway, they might enjoy those trees as old growth. But anyway, so we've done the trees and we bought the land, and to some extent we've been successful. We're old, hey? So big deal. You buy some land, you save it while you're alive. The minute you're dead, your children need some money to, send their kid to college, whatever, and they sell the land. So what are we going to do to make it that it wasn't a waste of time? All right, so we try to search for land trusts. They're going to save it for us. Okay, but we have had trouble in that search. And that search, the trouble has been that unlike everyone we've ever met, we don't meet that many people, but everyone we've ever met, they are okay with public access. But we have noticed, I'm sure you might have, that the public isn't quite what it used to be. You know, I mean, trash and ATVs and whatever. So we want no public access. Whoa. You go to a land trust and they say, well, you know, we're trying to raise money to save this land, and very few people will give money. They may never want to actually walk on your land, but the notion that they can't, goodbye, we're not giving you the money. Okay, so we've had a little trouble. More than a little trouble. Anyway, so one day I was on the internet and I saw this ad, or kind of an ad from the federal government. Okay, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, the Wildlife Reserve Easement. So what is that? So I looked into it. It's marvelous. I'm telling you, as Billy Crystal would say, it's marvelous. Okay, so why is it marvelous? They allow you to not cut the trees. Most easements, because of the money they have to raise, because it's federal money or state money, you gotta cut the trees. You gotta cut them 10 years from now, 15, whatever, but you gotta cut the trees. It's a big problem. Okay, so they let you say, I don't wanna cut the trees. The second beautiful thing about this is that they, get this, they pay you for the easement that you're gonna give them. Now, without giving you my personal information, which of course we know you could probably find on the web, our experience on one piece of land, several $100,000. And it is almost in Canada. And the way they work it is the farther you are north, the less you get per acre, which is logical because they're basing it on what other people would pay for this land, pay for the easement, pay for the whatever. So I'm saying it's worth your while to look into the NRCS wetland reserve. Now you're going to say, well, what? I don't have any wetland. There's no ponds on my property. There's no streams, whatever. I'm going to give you a little story. I happen to have on this one piece of land 100 acres of wetland. More or less 100. I didn't know. It looked like 100. So I thought we'll get 100 acres. Okay, fine. I called them up. They came out. 2 ladies, hip boots. I had my hip boots on. We're walking out there. Definitely it's wetland. We're knee deep in water. Okay. Lady says to me, well, did you ever think about the other land that's connected to the 100 acres here? I said, well, it's uphill. It's mountains. Well, hey, she says to me, water rolls downhill. I said, really? I had no idea on that one. And then she says, we could take the whole deal. I said, really? 640 acres. Long story short, the 640 is in the easement. It works. Okay. Second thing I want to say, the current use law in New Hampshire is the best one in New England. It ain't great, but it's the best one. Why? Because it allows you to not cut the trees. There are 3 phases to current use. One is the standard, you don't give us a forest plan, you just give us current use, and you can keep it and not have to cut the trees. You get a tax benefit for doing that. I mean, it's serious. if you are taxed on your land as a house lot or multiple house lots, you know, you're gonna have deep pockets to keep that land. There's gonna be a lot of foresters coming by and saying, hey, gee, you know, we could send your kid to college. Let's cut a tree down here. Okay, but if you know, I pay the smallest tax bill I have is $3. I get that tax bill, I love it. When I get that tax bill, I say, my God, thank God for Section A79. Anyway, and I've looked at Vermont because I'm always presented with land. The land in Vermont is magnificent. Terrible current use. Okay, you've got to cut it. Okay, now Zach Porter, who's back there, he has tried beyond to get that change. It has not been changed. I mean, it's changed. If you've got some lily that someone discovered is the rarest thing in the world, you can get it. But other than that, you got to cut it. Okay, Massachusetts, you got to cut it. So I'm saying you got a really good current use law. Now, the final thing I'm going to say about these techniques that we've used is a Section 1031 IRS tax deferred exchange. They're going to say, whoa, wait a minute, what is that all about? Well, let's say that you have an apartment house, a house you're not using, well, anyway, whatever, and you want to sell it and buy some wild land that you're going to not conserve, preserve. A little different. Okay. How do you do that? Because if you sell it for $100, the IRS is going to take 25 bucks of it. You're going to have 75 bucks to invest in land number one that you're going to go for. So the fact that you can use this deferred taxation on the sale of this property. I'm getting a word that I have overstepped my 10 minutes. Okay.
A loving word.
Let me just say, let me finish up by saying it can be used in two ways. One is what I've described, but the second is you can sell as a tax deferred situation and an easement. Now, that is in the bowels of the description of this section 1031. I used it. I'm not in prison. Yeah, that's true. I've been watching the window over here, but really. So anyway, I have one final thing to say. I want to ask you, see, we're telling you a lot of things, but we're not asking you to do anything yet. I'm asking you, John will agree to this, plant a tree. Plant 5 trees.
I'll stand first.
If you got the cash, buy some land. Preserve it. We all got to do something. If you can't do anything, speed up your recycling. You know what I mean? Use less toilet paper, whatever, but we got to do something. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, everyone.
Well done.
Great. All right, turn over to Bob.
All right.
Talk about Northeast Wilderness Trust.
Northeast Wilderness Trust was established in 2002 to conserve land in New England and northern New York. We have protected more than 79,000 acres, including our newest preserve of 1,775 acres near the state's Hammond Pond Wild Forest in Mariah, New York, near Port Henry. That Mariah Wilderness Preserve, end of June closing, also adjoins a large tract of Lime Timber Company land that has a conservation easement on it, a working forest conservation easement on it. The establishment of Newt, we go by Newt, even though it's cheating a little bit, Northeast Wilderness Trust. The establishment of Newt was inspired by two historic events. The first was the New York State Constitutional Amendment of 1894 to protect the forest preserve in the Catskills and the Adirondacks, which said, in part, the lands of the state now owned or hereafter acquired, constituting the forest preserve as now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. So in the Adirondacks, you have a 3 million acre forest preserve that is forever wild. And if you've been over there and seen what the forests look like now, it's astonishing what's happened there. The second event was the passage of the Wilderness Act of 1964, which describes wilderness as follows. In contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Note the wilderness is not defined as pristine or ancient or untouched. The definition of wilderness itself actually comes down to the will of the land, self-willed land. Northeast Wilderness Trust's priority is to simply let natural processes and evolution take place uninhibited. I should note too that we use wilderness, wildlands, forever wildland kind of interchangeably. So how do we do our work? Much like other land trusts, we acquire land to hold, in our case, as preserves or sanctuaries. We also hold conservation easements on private land. What's different about Newt is that we are exclusively in the business of rewilding. We focus on protecting land as forever wild to benefit biodiversity, the development of old forest and eventual old growth forest, carbon sequestration and storage, and climate change mitigation and adaptation, along with preventing subdivision, development, and resource extraction, among other restrictions. No logging or agricultural uses occur on the land we protect. Any management we do is passive in nature. Trees fall, they stay where they fall. Also, somewhat unusual among land trusts for our preserves and sanctuaries, which means all the land that we own permanently in fee ownership. We use what we refer to as a belt and suspenders approach to permanent protection. This means that whenever possible, we convey a forever wild easement, conservation easement, to a willing land trust partner. So it's a second layer of protection. Even though we're highly unlikely to stray from our mission, we do that as a matter of course. Examples of how we do our work. The over 6,000 acre Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve in Woodbury, Elmore, Worcester, and Hardwick, Vermont. We purchased that in late 2021 outright at appraised value from a family-run timber company. And we've added 2, going on 3 parcels to it since that initial acquisition. For our preserves, again, we have whole land as preserves and as sanctuaries. For our preserves, we don't allow trapping or the hunting of predators, but we do allow hunting of abundant prey species, deer, turkey, ruffed grouse, and other pedestrian, foot-based recreational use. No ATVs, no mechanical transportation, no mountain bikes. Another example, the 820 acre Blue Mountain Wilderness Sanctuary in Reigate, Vermont, we purchased at the end of last November at appraised value from a landowner who had bought 1,000 acres over a number of years in the late 1990s. And he chose not to harvest from his forest. And about 5 years ago, he started looking for a land trust that would meet his needs. He ended up coming to Northeast Wilderness Trust because he wanted that perpetuation of the no harvesting routine. And also he wanted no hunting and no trapping. So we bought it and have established a sanctuary, which is, again, the other way we hold land in fee. So no trapping, no hunting. We do allow recreational use, and then sort of general recreational use. We typically do not build trails or have trails on our sanctuaries. We also receive gifts of land. The Wildwood was already named Wildwood. The Wildwood Wilderness Preserve in Dublin, New Hampshire was donated to Northeast Wilderness Trust by the Putnam family at the end of 2021 to ensure that 1/2 of their 1,100 acres would remain forever wild. The rest was conserved with the Monadnock Conservancy. For the 587 acres that Newt owns, we donated a forever wild easement to the Harris Center. In Byron, Maine, we're working on an easement donation by a private landowner on 1,300 acres that they bought in 3 parcels right into this year, actually, for the express purpose of conserving it as forever wild. They don't have a house on it, they don't have a cabin on it, they just want to be able to go there for recreational purposes, so they want to donate an easement to us. They're also willing to offer a right of first refusal or our proposed option to purchase at wildlands value, so that as a land trust, we're not in a position where we have kind of an unending number of private landowners. Somewhere down the line, somebody's going to decide they don't like the conservation easement that's on their land, and it will present some stewardship challenges because there's so many restrictions on the property. So we're trying to incorporate that into our conservation easements on individual landowners. Finally, we have a wildlands partnership program to provide incentive grants to other land trusts to protect land that they own or are buying with forever wild easements that Northeast Wilderness Trust will hold. We now steward forever wild easements on over 8,000 acres of land owned by 5 different land trusts in New York, Connecticut, and Maine. And we've got a whole slew of new applications in to continue that program. A few final comments about why this work is important today. We believe that protection of wildlands is complementary to other approaches to conservation. We are not pushing for all lands to be wilderness. However, according to the recent Wildlands in New England report, New England is 81% forest cover and only 3.3% is permanently protected as wildlands. The report, published this past May, took 3 years and was a collaboration between over 100 conservation organizations and state and federal agencies. The study calls for at least tripling the acreage of wildlands to 10% in the short term and up to 20% in the longer term. That large gap between current wildlands and recommended acreage of wildlands represents an urgent call for action for advancing wildlands protection. Wilderness is a central component of 30 by 30, the national and international goal to protect 30% of the land and waters of the earth to address the crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. In the face of climate change and biodiversity collapse, we know wilderness works, and we know that a planet rich in biodiversity is fundamental to our well-being. We are, after all, only one of a multitude of species. Northeast Wilderness Trust is committed to realizing a future where interconnected and resilient wildlands are shared by a human culture that recognizes the benefits of wild places, all integrated into a mosaic of woodlands, farmlands, and human communities.
Where would you like to start?
Well,
First hand I saw.
I'm from the Southern New Hampshire Conservation Commission. We tried to put together a panel about the potential of logging some of our public lands. The panel included our local county forester and the New Hampshire Extension Service forester, and I invited new members from Northeast Wilderness Trust to join us. As soon as they heard that Nuke was going to be part of this panel, they would have nothing to do with us. And ever since then, most foresters that I've run into will just either laugh about what Nuke's trying to do or just dismiss it as completely ridiculous. It does not stand in the line of traditional silviculture. What do we do?
Bill.
You know, when 400 years ago, when those British people landed in Massachusetts, Governor Winthrop wrote that he was faced with a forest wilderness filled with savages and beasts, and it needed to be changed to look like England, to civilize it. Civilizing it meant cut down the trees. For 400 years, that's been the dominant view. And when it was found you could make money by cutting down the trees, that became the dominant operating system of the US federal government and the state government of every state. Every state that has a forest has a provision that if you manage your trees to cut them down, you get a property tax break. There are very few states that have a provision that says if you maintain your forest and don't cut them down, you get a tax break. So everything is stacked against this, and it is just in the mentality. We're stuck with the mentality. The dominant mentality is that forests are either in the way and have to be removed, cleared for agriculture, cleared for subdivisions, whatever it is, or they are a resource to be exploited. And what foresters pride themselves on is that they can help you manage to cut down your trees as long as possible and have the trees grow back. That's basically their whole purpose. So to them, it is incomprehensible that forests are one of the two major cogs in the operation of the planet. And we are seeing that we're degrading them so much that we're making climate change worse. We're making biodiversity worse. North America's lost 30% of its number of birds, almost 3 billion birds since 1970. A lot of those are forest species. What does that tell you about the way we're managing our forests? We're managing them for timber, we're not managing them for their functionality. So you're just stuck with that as opposition. We're fortunate to have Dan here, who is a forester, who understands that this is all important, and he can explain that there are ways to get forest products and still have many of these functionalities that forests provide. So talk to Dan. He will, and he also thinks it's not a bad idea to have some wilderness areas, right?
Well, by all means.
Yeah, so, I introduce you to a reasonable man.
I wish my wife were here.
Yeah, you can share.
I wanted to add one thing, it's tangential in a way, but also on point, is that I worked, as somebody mentioned, Zach also did, but trying to change things in Vermont. And it didn't work so well, but my next run at it, or somebody's next run at it, I think the reason I expressed that carbon credits were a useful tool is that I think the winning argument is that if the states started realizing, oh, people are getting money other than from harvesting that they can tax, the income from the carbon credits, their song might change. And so I think the answer long-term is around policy is to say, here's a source of money that would be encouraging trees to grow, but you can still get your tax money from it.
Yeah, and I'd love to just add one thing just to sort of do my newt thing, because I am a newt. we are very much at the table with those in the woodlands area, farms, communities. We are not separated from it in terms of the work. We are doing our own thing, but it's a complementary, I think Bob used that term, complementary, that we need all of that. So to think that we are only doing this in a vacuum and thinking that every tree everywhere should never be cut down, that's not what this is about. We need a protected wilderness in order to protect the cog in the wheel. And that's the role of Northeast Wilderness Trust. We're doing it privately. Every dollar is a tree. Every dollar is another acre. Every dollar is another bird that's going to be saved. Every dollar is, a stream that's going to be protected to help us with the flooding that's going to go back to nature. So that's a really important distinction about it when people assume that we're only talking forever wild. We are, but we are not just one of many as a species. We're also one of many of the organizations out there that are seeing the holistic systemic approach to the future of humans on the planet. The planet's going to be fine without us, but we have some choices to make here, and we are one of a set of solutions in harmony with other land use. So just to put that in context.
Before you leave that, could you, we do have some copies of the
Yes, there is.
Executive summary of that wildlands
Yes.
report that I mentioned.
I will put them out. If someone wants them, come see me. I have just a few. So the Wildlands in New England report that just came out, yeah, they're on the side in the other room. The Wildlands in New England report that just came out of the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities Initiative out of the Highstead Foundation that's been around since 2016 and before, looking at the mix of our land use. That report looks at it and says only 3.3% is forever wild. To do what needs to be done to course correct what's happening to our planet, to our world, to all of us, it's necessary to increase that number. And we have the report that shows you that. There's actually a specific New Hampshire study. I don't have those with me. They're available online. In your packet that you have, or if you don't, will be available in the Google Doc. There is a QR code at the back of at the back of Bob's presentation that takes you to our website. Lots of resources there. And again, context, holistic. We are not here just talking about one thing, but we're talking about a very critical piece of our future.
In answer to this, not an answer, but in collaboration with it, this is why is this resistance that you can understand but not accept. And that is that everything that the society does is connected to money. Okay, so if the logging industry, which is complex, you got truckers, you got mills, you got loggers, you got the whole deal. You got pellets, okay. If that is set against what we're trying to do, then the only solution to me is private money buying private pieces of property and saving them. Because, keep in mind that the majority of the forest is in private hands. It is not in the state hands. It is not in federal hands, if you take the whole country. Okay, so we are in the majority. Whatever. So, now I know it's not easy. I mean, we're driving a used car. Okay, we're not going on cruises. We're buying land. Okay, so I don't know who else is willing to do that. But I'm saying that's what we gotta be willing to do. Because if we aren't, the forces of evil are definitely stacked against us.
I'm going to interrupt for a second here because this is their turn and we could at them. So I think there was a second hand that came up that right here and then, okay, I'm not sure who was next, but yeah, go ahead. Okay, you're next.
Am I now?
Yes, you're
next. Okay.
Someone's behind you.
I was wondering about the panel's opinion about folks who talk about developing old growth forests through the use of structural complexity enhancement, like Bill Keaton at UVM, basically doing selective harvesting on a basis in order to develop a more diverse woodland. Is that, what do you guys think about that?
I can speak to that. Vertical structure, of course, is limbs and things that are growing up, and that's very important to many things. Try to leave hemlocks in your old forest. Hemlocks are one of the best. The birds will flock to that. Everything goes to the shelter, that they provide. And mothers have cub trees, and where the limbs come way down, and you look up, you don't see anything. Well, look, there's probably bear claw marks on them where she sends her cubs up there because they can't be seen. So that's vertical structure, and that's very important. So that's when I was saying have someone just drop a tree once in a while to create some of the values that might not be in the forest that you're trying to grow.
Could I just add, I would urge that you not do that in forests that already have that structure.
Right.
For sure. I guess if it's an oak growth forest, you're not going to go and make it more like an oak growth forest.
Right.
But if it's a uniform 60-year-old, 80-year-old uniform, it was clear cut in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Does that make sense?
We can improve on the mistakes of the past, is what we're saying.
Does that make sense? So does that approach promoted by some folks like Bill? Does that?
I would argue that when you're dealing with a 60 to 80-year-old forest, you're going to get, in terms of just strictly climate mitigation in the next 30 years, you're going to get more if you just let it grow.
That's right.
It's got a lot more stocking that it can absorb, and so that is going back to you cut something and take it out of the forest. That doesn't come back until double the age of whatever tree you took out. Over the long haul, yeah, we could probably, we should have been doing that 50 years ago. We would be in a different place. But right now, it's how much carbon can you sequester and store in big trees, how rapidly, I don't think it is important if you're dealing with a 60 to 80-year-old.
Right, I think there was a question in the back, all the way behind you.
Okay.
That I want to capture, and then you can be next. The white shirt person, human, can be next. Go ahead.
Sorry, one of my questions was bouncing off of a previously asked one. I just wanted to kind of circle back to Dan, the reasonable person, in asking what, like, reasonable, in what the Forest Service's and foresters' view is on, like, wildlands preservation on Newt, and why it is that way, when it sounds like everybody's just trying to work towards the same goal in different ways. And when that's the case, then how come there isn't more unity within, like, this, like, ecosystem of a community?
A lot of foresters are agronomists. They're growing crops, and that's the mistake. Foresters should be growing forest ecosystems, not crops. But it's easy to get caught up in the crops thing because you kind of learn that in forestry school. I don't know what they're learning now, but it might still be the same. You have those massive statistical courses about all of this stuff about how to grow as much as you can grow and also harvest as much as you can harvest in appropriate ways. So they're stuck in it. And they just need to be shaken a little bit because it's hard to change them without, rattling their cage and saying, look, there's more important things.
I wanted to focus a light on something that John Rose said in passing and just have him illuminate that a little more. We have bought the bamboo toilet paper and paper towels a couple of times, but I wasn't really sure when I did that if it was greenwashing or if it was good. And I heard you mention, thumbs up. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. If you have more to share with us.
Just quickly, that things that grow quickly, an annual crop, if you harvest that and use that, you're carbon neutral because you're within that. You've cycled it very quickly. Nothing got stored. An old tree is the opposite of that. It's stored it for 100 years, and now you're turning it into toilet paper that disappears in a year. And so bamboo is a grass. It's not a tree, and it grows really quickly in plantation settings. and we underutilize it, and it's got a good fiber. Is it the ideal tree? I don't know. There are other ones that might be also possible. Right now, we've got a lot of technology that is in economics terms called stranded value, and people want to use that up before they start shifting. But I would argue, yes, that it is, even though some reviews have said, oh, it's not as green, I would argue that just from a pure carbon perspective, it's a lot better than an old tree.
Someone right in the back, gentleman in the back with the flag.
Stand up because I can't see you. My name is Tom Thompson. I live just up the road in Orford, and I've owned forest land for 66 years. So I know a little bit about practicing good sustainable forestry as a certified tree farmer. We practice wildlife habitat, creating recreational opportunities, protecting water, and actually timbering harvest. The gentleman that spoke about current use, I don't know what your name is because I don't know.
Eric Jones.
Eric. I agree with you on the current use. I've served on that board for many years, and it's good to hear someone that agrees with you. But I also agree that if people want to purchase land and put it into wild land, as you have done, that I encourage you to do that. That's your right, and you can do that, whether it be in New Hampshire or Vermont or anywhere. But some of the discussions not cutting trees, I find a little bit disturbing when I have to cut trees to maintain the investment I have in 2,800 acres on my property. And in doing that, I open it and share it with the general public, which the state then, in their recreation, which is number 2 in the state of New Hampshire, uses our land as the private landowners, and we don't get paid for anything. I'm not asking for that. But I think there should be a balance. If people want to put their land in wildlife, they should be able to do that. And I encourage you to do it if that's what you believe in. But in my case, I want to manage that land as I have and continue with that and pass it on to the next generation. Or my alternative is, which I'm sure you would agree with me is not a good one, is I could subdivide that land and sell it off, and my wife and I could go down and live on one of the islands wherever we wanted to. I don't want to do that. I want to manage the forest. I love being in the forest and working in the forest. And I will stack up what I have done over 66 years against anybody, anywhere, as far as forestry and good stewardship forestry. Thank you.
I can respond to that, Tom. If we're successful, keep in mind it's 3.1% of the total that we're talking about so far, that our thoughts are holding on the land. If we're successful and get 10 or 20%, what's going to happen to your per 1,000 board feet price? It's going to go up. We're helping you. Now, I'm seriously, I've thought about this, because I obviously, someone, maybe John over here said, I've been picking on John, but anyway, he said we've got to be careful about the people who are in the forest industry if we are to reduce their inventory, you might say, make sure that we aren't putting them out of business. Well, the way I look at it is supply and demand. So if we've got a bunch of land that we keep out of that stream, you're going to get more for every 1,000 board feet. So you still don't have to go to the Caribbean. Although you can afford more if the Caribbean got more expensive. Anyway.
It's not underwater because of climate change. Thank you, Eric. Bill, do you want to go? And then there's a question I've got just quickly. One, woman with the hat, do you still have a question?
Oh, sure. Yes,
Two,
I do.
and then three. So I'm just
Thank
going to give you that for a minute, the lineup, because we have some great questions. And
First of all, congratulations on managing your land the way you have for this period of time. Here's the situation. The U.S. Forest Service classifies forests in three categories: timberlands, timberland forest, reserve forests, and other forests. In the United States, timberland forests are 70%. In New England, it's 95%. What that means is that 95% of our forests are suitable for producing timber. What is a reserve forest? Well, that's what's in national parks, and that's about 16% of the forests. The studies show that the amount of carbon in those forests is greater than the amount of carbon in the forests that surround it that are managed for timber production. All right. So, and other forests are just forests that are scruffy forests that aren't good for timber. So we have a situation where the presumption is that virtually all forests in New England should be for harvesting. What the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, we need somewhere between 30 and 50% of those forests to be ecologically functional. So they're not asking for everything. But when I raise this with people in the forestry industry, they seem to want it all. They don't want to see anything that is not available for them to come and harvest. What that has done is, in the United States and in New England, the average age of our forests in New England is probably, 50 to 70 years or something like that range, something. All right, these are species that have a 200 and 300 year lifetime on them. So we have little trees, young trees in our forests, and then those get cut when they're big enough for the sawmill. And at that point, they are storing maybe 1/10 of what they're capable of. In the handout I have a picture like this, which is put together. A single red oak stores 8 tons of carbon. It's about 150 years old. If you were to ask, well, what would a 50-foot tall tree, red oaks, store? Well, it would take 35 of them to store the same amount of carbon. So our littler trees just don't store as much carbon as our big trees. And so we have to have a place where we can grow big trees. That's what Let the Trees Get Old is all about. And I was involved in a study out in Oregon where they found that the Forest Service wanted to start cutting trees that were bigger than 21 inches. They've been banned from doing that since the 1990s. And so a young guy came and he said, there's a U.S. Forest Service survey of these trees. And so we could measure how many there were. Well, of the trees that were bigger than 21 inches, it was only 3% of the trees, but they held 42% of the carbon. So we need to have some fraction, 30%, 50%, whatever it is, in forests that can grow these big trees to remove enough carbon and store it out of the atmosphere, or else we're going to lose our forests altogether. Right? We're just not going to have forests because climate change keeps going the way it's going. So I'm perfectly happy having half or maybe more still in production, but we can't just keep all of them at the same forest cycle. The trees just don't get big enough to store enough carbon. So yes, we need forest products. I like forest products. I use them. And if the forest industry had access to half of the timberlands, I think there'd still be a viable industry. And as was just said, you'd probably get more money because you have to be more focused on the lands that are available.
question right here. Thank you.
Doug, you had
Someone has.
you have your hand up.
Okay. I want to put together something that Dan said and something that John said. If you set aside a forest and just let it grow, sort of with benign neglect, as has almost been suggested, something bad could happen, like Dan mentioned. It could become a buckthorn forest. What have you to suggest about one's duty to maintain an unmaintained forest?
What we're doing in that situation is we're simply taking care of, well, we're dealing with the issues that we created. The forest did not create those situations. They were not there. So to get rid of the invasives is to my mind, has to be done.
Thinking in Hanover, for example, the town owns a lot of land and spends almost nothing to maintain it. And there are corners of it now that are buckthorn forests. And I'm seeking advice on how the town should spend its money or get its money to do that.
Oh, golly, you're asking me to advocate cutting trees to get rid of the buckthorn? That's a tough argument for me to make in this crowd.
Bob, do you want?
I would just say that our experience on land that we have acquired and do not go into to manage, we're not driving equipment in there, we're not constantly cutting trees and making openings, we're not introducing invasives because of all that action. We're seeing so far very little problem on our preserves from invasives. That doesn't mean we won't have problems with them. It doesn't mean we won't have a buckthorn forest occasionally. But so far, so good. And the other thing I'll say is that the point has been made, at least in our experience, we know we're not going to be able to manage our way out of the invasives issue. We're going to have to take the long view from our perspective and recognize that there are going to be changes in the forest. Some of them we won't like. Some species, invasives, quote unquote, are going to naturalize. Some species have naturalized that were considered terrible invasives. They have become less of a problem and become part of the forest community. So at least from the Forever Wild long-term perspective, we think of the Adirondacks as the example of an area that over the last 150 plus years has become the forest we want our preserves to become 100, 150 years from now.
Yeah, I just, I'm someplace in between those two probably, and it's very much, actually, Dan and I would probably agree in the fine details, but it's the landscape, wherever that forest is really important if you make a decision to manage or not manage. And so there's not one size fits all. If you're in the interior and you don't have a lot of deer and you can manage something that's fairly light without getting a lot of other light and seed sources in there, probably worth it. At the edge, it's probably a never-ending battle and you might have to ignore it. So it's a really delicate, and it gets just so much more complicated in a place like Hanover where the deer population is high. They are acting as invasives in a way, and if you create ideal conditions, you're just going to get more. So it's a tough question.
So please, we have one last question and one last person question, and then we will wrap.
You know, I love you guys. You're doing great. I'm Deer Way, Old Way. I'm a deer person, okay, in the Abenaki sense of the word. Allen Bayou. And this is just silly. Come to our place out in West Hartford, you'll see a place where the maple saplings and the oak saplings and you know, all the plants you want to have grow are doing fine. Because deer are people too. Nokiak, Wabanakiak, same ending, all human beings. I mean, we even have 23% of identical DNA with trees and plants, right? okay? There's much more to be said about this. I'm not going to go on. Some of you have heard me go on, and I won't. But I do appreciate you bringing up the native people of New England in the early days. Every town and village in Vermont, northern New York, New Hampshire, and western and eastern Maine is filled with native people who are taking care of the land in an ancient way where everything is in balance. And there are some extraordinary examples of that, including what I'm talking about on our land in West Hartford. And we know virtually nothing about it. Now, I have to say, consider Native nations and Native peoples in all of this, because in 2009 and 10, there was a grand plan to log and whack a particular part of the Green Mountain Forest. And actually, because one Native nation from Mississippi intervened, the Green Mountain Forest and the federal government said, okay, never mind, Rosanna Dana. The power of Native peoples to transform, to take care of and transform the lands that we now see as suffering or buckthorn inhabited or whatever to something else is remarkable. And the last thing I'll say is about the emerald ash borer. Who eats emerald ash borer? Right. I mean, maybe you don't know, but it's parasitic wasps from China and Mongolia. Well, several of Beneke enclaves are actually talking to the parasitic wasps, of which there are, 60, 70? On our land alone, there's about 30 different varieties of these guys, these women, actually. And, we've asked them to intervene with the emerald ash borer. Now, that can sound completely crazy to most people. What are you talking about? Well, maybe. But I beg you to consider that there's so much more to bring to bear here, even where buckthorn and barberry and all of that is involved. Much, much more. And I thank you all. I mean, you guys are brilliant, and you're brilliant as well. I really look forward to what's next. I love John Donovan and all the rest of the people here. So thank you very much. And all of you.
John should be thanked here, just quickly, John should be thanked here for bringing this all together.
Yeah. The words you just said are the words that are most important. What can bring us all together? There's a balance here. We have foresters here who do important work. We have people who have worked the land for a long time. It doesn't have to be opposition here. We have to find a balance. Preserving trees, old growth forests, most foresters have never seen it or created it. They haven't had a chance to. And that's just because we've been cutting our forest down. But there is a balance there because we do need forest products. Those of us who have been carpenters, work with wood, it's a beautiful, something to work with. So that's what I want to and I'm so glad that we have that cross section here of folks who have worked the land and been here. But we are in a different paradigm now, so we have to work together. We have to work together to preserve the land and to do the kind of forestry that really can produce the products that we need without, the ways that it's been in the past with clear cutting and things like that. I want to give a special hand to the crew here from Howe Library who made this impossible. They would not have been able to do it. Standing here, I can't say enough for, we got a team here. We'd like to work this again. Thank you so much for your time. If you haven't signed up and you want more information, as we move along, please fill out as we go. And again, Sir Ernest Shackleton said, optimism is true moral courage. And this is a time when we need courage because of the changes going on. And it's a moral issue for us, one of ethics as well. So thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to future events.
Yeah.